The fog was a ghost, a cold, damp shroud clinging to the French fields of Lorraine. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams stood in the turret of his M4 Sherman, the metal biting through his uniform. Through his binoculars, the mist-swirled landscape was a void, but he knew what was coming. The warning had been urgent. German Panzer forces massing for a counterattack. Intelligence estimated at least 200 tanks, most of them the dreaded Panthers. He lowered the glasses, his eyes dropping to the cramped ammunition racks inside the turret. Nestled among the standard 76mm armor-piercing rounds were 4 shells with unfamiliar stenciled markings. T4 HVAP, high-velocity armor, piercing, experimental. They were a secret, a whispered promise, and his battalion had received exactly 4 per tank. The orders were strict, use sparingly, critical shortage. The math was brutal and known to every Sherman crewman from Normandy to the Ardennes. A Panther's sloped frontal armor had an effective thickness of nearly 150 millimeters. The standard American M62 shell could penetrate only 109. It was like throwing pebbles at a steel door. But these new tungsten rounds, the firing range reports claimed 178 millimeters of penetration. They were a glimmer of hope in a steel coffin. And Abrams, though he couldn't know it yet, was holding the key to a victory that would defy all odds. The problem had been years in the making, a doctrinal failure that now cost lives in burning fields across France. American tank philosophy had split its armored force in two. Tanks supported infantry, while specialized tank destroyers hunted enemy armor. This logic held when the enemy was the Panzer IV, a tank the Sherman could handle. But it catastrophically ignored the Panther, a 45-ton masterpiece of German engineering with a high-velocity gun that could kill a Sherman from 2,000 meters away. The Sherman's standard ammunition couldn't penetrate a Panther's front, even point blank. By the summer of 1944, desperation set in. Crews resorted to ramming Panthers to flip them, or firing at their tracks to immobilize them for artillery. Casualty rates soared. Shermans earned the grim nickname Ronsons for their tendency to ignite upon a single hit. A solution was years away in the form of the heavy T-26 Pershing tank, but frontline crews needed salvation now. They needed a miracle, and unbeknownst to them, that miracle was being fought over in conference rooms an ocean away. The battle behind the battle was more bureaucratic than any tank duel. In a cramped ballistics laboratory at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, a civilian engineer his name lost to history, recorded only as research staff pored over pre-war German technical journals. He remembered a concept others had dismissed: sub-caliber penetrators. Instead of hurling a heavy, full-size shell, what if you fired a small, incredibly dense core of tungsten carbide wrapped in a lightweight sheath or sabot that would fall away after firing? The physics were undeniable. The same amount of propellant would accelerate the lighter projectile to a much higher velocity. Furthermore, tungsten carbide was harder than armor plate. It wouldn't mushroom on impact like steel, but would punch through like a needle. He sketched the design and presented it to the Ordnance Committee in early 1943. The response was immediate and dismissive. Impossible. The tungsten supply was too scarce, the manufacturing too difficult, the chamber pressures dangerously high. The established experts, men with decades of artillery experience, shut him down. Their solution was to wait for the Pershing. But this anonymous engineer did not stop. In a workshop the size of a janitor's closet, using rejected tungsten cores from cutting tool factories, he hand-built his first prototypes. On a cold March morning in 1943, he loaded one into a test 76mm gun. The crack was sharper, the velocity staggering. The tungsten core streaked downrange and punched clean through a plate of captured German armor that standard shells merely dented. It was a triumph. He submitted his report. The committee's response was a single furious sentence: discontinue this dangerous line of inquiry immediately. The engineer, however, was not alone. His test films and data found their way to Major General Gladion Barnes, the Chief of Research and Development for the Ordnance Department. A West Point graduate who understood engineering, Barnes saw past the bureaucracy and recognized raw potential. He watched the footage of the tungsten core slicing through armor that had repelled every other round, and he acted. Without full committee approval, he authorized the production of 60 rounds for field testing. At a heated May 1943 committee meeting, faced with renewed objections about safety and tungsten shortages, Barnes played his final card. He presented not only the devastating test footage, but also a fresh telegram from the Italian front. American tank destroyers at Anzio had failed to penetrate German Tiger tanks at point-blank range. The plea from the front lines was undeniable. Reluctantly, the committee authorized limited production for operational testing, with a silent threat of court-martial for Barnes if the project failed. The logistical hurdles were as formidable as the German armor. The United States produced only 4,400 tons of tungsten annually, nearly all of it consumed by essential war industries. There was barely enough for a meaningful quantity of the new shells, designated T4 HVAP. The manufacturing process was equally daunting. Machining the incredibly hard tungsten carbide cores required diamond, tipped tools, and painstaking precision. By the time of the D-Day landings on the 6th of June 1944, not a single Sherman rolling onto the Normandy beaches carried this revolutionary ammunition. It was still sitting in depots, deemed unnecessary by commanders who clung to the outdated belief that tanks would rarely fight tanks. They were tragically wrong. Throughout the summer, casualty reports flooded back. Sherman crews were dying in their burning tanks, and the grim mathematics of their inferiority became a daily reality. The urgency finally forced action. In August, the first shipment of T4 HVAP rounds arrived in France for battlefield testing. Against a captured Panther, the results were stark. A standard M62 shell, fired at 500 meters, ricocheted off the Panther's sloped glacis plate with a pathetic whine. An HVAP round, fired from the same gun at the same range, punched through the front plate and exploded out the back. The cable sent to Washington was unequivocal. The round worked. But the tungsten shortage meant crippling rationing. Tank units equipped with the 76mm gun received a pittance sometimes as few as 2 of these precious rounds per gun per month. This scarcity bred a new kind of battlefield ingenuity. Desperate crews, hearing the Soviets use tungsten in their anti-tank rounds, began to scavenge the French countryside for abandoned Russian equipment, bartering with ordnance officers to have the cores repackaged into 76mm sabots. A black market for tungsten was born, unofficially sanctioned by commanders who understood that survival sometimes required bending the rules. The stage for this desperate innovation was the quiet French countryside around Arracourt. On the morning of the 19th of September 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion, a fragment of Patton's 4th Armored Division, was all that stood in the path of the 5th Panzer Army's massive counterattack. Through the lifting fog, the dark silhouettes of advancing Panthers emerged like beasts from a legend. Abrams had 69 Shermans. Most were the older 75mm variants, and only 18 of his tanks carried the upgraded 76mm gun. Those 18 held the battalion's only hope: 4 HVAP rounds each. 70, 2 precious shells against an avalanche of German steel. The order was given to hold fire, to let the Panthers close the distance. The tension was a physical weight inside every turret. Normal doctrine was useless here. This would be a battle of precision, not volume. As the lead Panther closed to 600 meters, Abrams broke the silence. Load HVAP. The metallic click of the rare round chambering was a sound of finality. The gunner squeezed the trigger. The report was different, a sharper, vicious crack that tore through the morning air. The tungsten core, a sliver of impossible hardness, crossed the distance in an instant. Where standard shells would have sparked and ricocheted, this one tore through the Panther's frontal plate as if it were parchment. A second later, an internal explosion erupted, lifting the turret from the hull in a gout of flame and smoke. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. Another Sherman fired, then another. Each HVAP round found its mark. Each strike resulted in a catastrophic kill. Within minutes, 8 Panthers were burning wrecks on the field, their invincibility shattered. The Germans, accustomed to Allied shells bouncing harmlessly away, were thrown into confusion. The battle raged for days, a brutal engagement that defied all conventional military logic. Abrams and his crews exercised near fanatical discipline with their secret weapon. They used standard ammunition for suppression and ranging, only sliding one of their precious tungsten rounds into the breech when they had a guaranteed shot. The 4 rounds per tank were not wasted. They were surgical instruments. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. German tank commanders, who had advanced with the confidence of giants, suddenly found themselves vulnerable. The American Shermans, which they had been taught to disdain, were now dealing death from the front. A captured German lieutenant later confessed that it destroyed morale completely. The Americans were no longer just ramming or flanking, they were killing Panthers head-on, and the myth of German armored superiority evaporated in the fires that consumed the Lorraine fields. The victory at Arracourt was no fluke. It was a validation born of desperation and engineering brilliance, and its echoes would resonate through the remainder of the war. In the 11 days of fighting around the small French town, Abrams' outnumbered battalion and supporting units achieved a kill ratio that stunned both armies. 86 German tanks, mostly Panthers, destroyed for the loss of only 25 Shermans. The secret was not a better tank, but better ammunition, used with ruthless efficiency. The handful of HVAP rounds, fired only when a killing shot was guaranteed, had turned the tide. The news spread through the American ranks like a current of electricity. The Panther, once a symbol of terror, was now a target. While the tungsten shortage remained a critical bottleneck, the psychological shift was immediate and profound. American crews, who had once felt outclassed, now hunted with renewed confidence. This newfound capability would be tested one final brutal time during the Battle of the Bulge later that winter. As Hitler's Panthers and Tigers spearheaded his last great offensive through the frozen Ardennes, American tank crews met them with their hard-won knowledge and their carefully hoarded HVAP shells. The encounters were still deadly. The German guns could easily kill any Sherman, but they were no longer one-sided. A staff sergeant from the 10th Armored Division captured the change in sentiment, writing home, "The Panthers used to terrify us. Now we hunt them. 2 HVAP rounds through the turret, and they're done." The ammunition did not make the Sherman invulnerable, but it made it a credible opponent. It gave crews a fighting chance, transforming them from prey into predators. For every German tank destroyed by a tungsten core, 5 American soldiers, a driver, a bow gunner, a loader, a gunner, and a commander, were given a chance to survive the war and go home. The struggle for supply, however, never ceased. Despite the proven success, total production of the now designated M93 HVAP round reached only about 350,000 by war's end, a tiny fraction of the millions of conventional shells fired. The black market for tungsten cores scavenged from Soviet battlefields became an open secret, a necessary rebellion against impossible constraints. Commanders like Patton turned a blind eye, prioritizing the lives of their men over strict logistical protocols. The stories of crews trading whiskey or cigarettes for the heavy, gray penetrators became part of the battalion lore. This ingenuity in the face of scarcity underscored a profound truth. The will to survive could often bridge the gap between what was officially provided and what was desperately needed on the front lines. The war ended, but the legacy of those 4 precious shells endured. In the quiet of peace, the anonymous civilian engineer at Aberdeen Proving Ground was quietly promoted to senior research engineer, his name remaining a footnote in declassified documents, his medalist contribution known only to a few. He retired in obscurity, while the man who carried his invention into battle, Creighton Abrams, rose to become a 4-star general and Army Chief of Staff. Their stories, the thinker and the warrior, converged one last time in 1980 when the United States unveiled its new main battle tank, a beast of unparalleled power and sophistication. It was named the M1 Abrams, a permanent tribute to the commander who understood how to use a technological gamble to save his men. And its primary weapon? A massive cannon-firing, armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot rounds long, sleek, tungsten darts traveling at over 5,000 feet per second. They were the direct, evolved descendants of the experimental T4 shells that had once saved a battalion in a foggy French field. The lesson of Arracourt was not merely about ballistics or metallurgy. It was a timeless story of challenging, entrenched wisdom. It was about the stubborn individual who, faced with a unanimous impossible, quietly built a prototype in a closet-sized workshop. It was about the commander who trusted data over doctrine and the soldiers whose discipline turned a handful of rounds into a decisive advantage. In the end, the difference between defeat and victory, between life and death for 1,200 tank crews, hinged on a simple, radical idea. When you cannot overpower a barrier, you must change the point of attack. The bureaucracy had insisted on building a bigger hammer. The engineer provided a sharper nail. This legacy continues to roll onto modern battlefields, from the deserts of the Middle East to the plains of Ukraine, where modern Abrams tanks fire their own tungsten penetrators, upholding a principle proven 8 decades ago. It is a powerful reminder that innovation often blooms in the face of necessity, and that the courage to question the experts can alter the course of history. The echoes of those 4 shells fired in Lorraine are a testament to the unyielding human spirit that refuses to accept the impossible. If this story of perseverance and hidden heroes resonated with you, if it reminded you that one idea can change everything, then please show your support by liking this video, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing for more deep dives into the forgotten turning points of history. Let us know in the comments. When have you faced a challenge that everyone said was impossible? Your insight is what makes this community so valuable.